In our second session of From Eastern Europe to the Lower East Side, as Mark said, this is a three-part series where we're exploring migration and settlement of Eastern European Jews in America from 1880 to 1924. And tonight we're going to look at what happens when these Eastern European Jews get off the boat. As Mark said, I'm Joellyn Zollman. I'm your guide to this historical journey, which, as I said last time, includes the stories of many of our own families. This period, 1880 to 1924, brings more than 2.5 million Jews to America from Eastern Europe. Most contemporary American Jews have a family member who arrived during this period. And for that reason, I thought it might be fun to see if we have any landsmen in the class tonight. Landsman is this terrific Yiddish word, which means exactly what it sounds like. Landsman means people from the same land, from the same town. So if you have family who came from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1924, and if you know the name of the shtetl, the small market town, or the city that they came from in Poland or Russia or Romania, please put the name of that place in the chat. And then keep an eye out for others from that same place. Okay? See if you have any landsmen in the room. For some of you, I know that that genealogy is a passion. And if that's the case for you, or if you're just starting to get interested in your own family history, whether your family comes from Eastern Europe during the period we're studying tonight, or came an entirely different wave of immigration to America, the place that I would direct you to is a site called Jewish Genealogy, jewishgen.org. It's up there on the screen. And if you're interested after tonight, or just generally in learning more about your own family history, that's the place that I would send you to find all of your landsmen who might still be around. So I wanted us to start by looking for landsmen in class tonight, because Jewish geography is always fun, but also because it's a way to start thinking about why so many of this group of immigrant Jews settled and stayed in New York City. Last week in our time together, we focused on the push and pull factors for this group of Jewish immigrants. We considered the situation in Russia, the pogroms and the melas, the resulting revolution in Jewish life that pushed these immigrants out of Russia. We also saw last time the allure of America, with its promises of economic and social opportunity as well as political freedom. We talked about the journey to America, the efforts of Western Jews to help fund resettlement, and we got these Jews, these immigrant Jews, to Ellis Island. And now this week, as I said, I want to examine what happens when they get off the boat. Where do they settle? What kinds of communities and organizations do these immigrant Jews create? That's our topic for tonight. Now, we learned last week that 80% of Jewish immigrants who arrived between 1880 and 1924 settled and stayed in New York City. 80% settled and stayed in New York City. This is a different pattern of settlement than previous waves of Jewish immigrants. The first group of Jewish immigrants to America, the Sephardim, they came during the colonial period and they settled on the East Coast. They hugged the coast. The Germans, who we studied together last year, arrived across the span of the 19th century, and they settled in every corner of the country. But the Eastern Europeans, who came at the turn of the century, they settled and stayed for the most part in New York City. Why? Why, if you were a Jewish immigrant, were you going to settle and stay in New York City? Well, one factor that's going to influence where these immigrant Jews decide to settle and stay was their landsmen. Family, friends, neighbors who already established themselves on the Lower East Side provided an instant community for the newly arrived immigrant. Community, including religious community, was important to these immigrants, many of whom were traditionally religious and sought kosher food and a familiar worship service. To this end, Eastern European immigrants created institutions to foster these old world ties, and these institutions were called Landsmannschaften. The Landsmannschaften were associations of immigrants from the same hometown. And the Landsmannschaften typically took the name of the old world community from which the immigrant came. So Anshe Timkowitz, for example, was for the people who came from the shtetl of Timkowitz. The Bialystoker Association was for those who were from Bialystok. So these Landsmannschaften gathered people who came from the same spot in the old world and organized for them study and worship and mutual aid and support in the new world. Imagine how comforting this must have been for these newcomers to find a ready-made community full of familiar people who spoke your dialect of Yiddish, recreated the worship service you were used to, and helped to ease your transition to a new country. Just as important as the Landsmannschaften, though, was the economic situation of America at the turn of the century. When you consider why the vast majority of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who came to America settled and stayed in New York, it was in no small part because work was more available to them there than in other parts of the country. And I'm going to say more about the nature of that work in just a few minutes. Drawn by the presence of their landsmen and by economic opportunity, more than 1.5 million immigrant Jews made New York City their home between 1880 and 1924. In fact, as you can see on the screen, by 1927, 44% of America's Jews lived in New York City. 44% of all of American Jewry was located in New York City. Of the other large cities with major Jewish populations, including, and I'm going to name them in descending order, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Newark, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco, none of these places even came close to New York in terms of size of Jewish community. Chicago came closest. It had 8% of the total of American Jewry in 1927. That's, again, compared to New York, which had 44%. The New York story is the headline story of American Jewish life during this period. In all of these American cities, including New York, Jews tended to settle in neighborhoods close to their port of entry, close to the place that they came into the city. Why? Because housing in those areas tended to be inexpensive, and factories and small businesses, economic opportunities were close by. In New York, this meant the Lower East Side. There's a medical historian by the name of Deborah Dwork who has done a close study of the housing conditions on the Lower East Side at the turn of the century, and her work is really interesting. I like her really detailed portraits of the neighborhood, so I'm going to share some of her research with you tonight. The other place, by the way, to go for a really interesting and informative look at life on the Lower East Side over time, including during the period that we're studying now, is the Tenement Museum in New York City. If you haven't been there, I really recommend that you visit. They also have a decent website. You can learn a lot just by going to the website, but it's even better to go in person if you have the opportunity to visit. Okay, so here's what Deborah Dwork, scholar Deborah Dwork, tells us about life on the Lower East Side of New York at the turn of the 20th century. And bear with me because I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you. But I like them because I think they help us really to imagine what this neighborhood was like. So the Lower East Side was dense, it was teeming, and it was honestly pretty filthy. In 1895, the New York Times reported that sections of the Lower East Side were more densely populated than the most crowded parts of Bombay, London, and Prague. Deborah Dwork found this 1896 social census of the Lower East Side that counted 989 tenement houses, 8 public schools, 3 theaters, 16 stables, 13 pawn shops, 72 restaurants, 41 churches, 31 of which were synagogues, 65 factories, 172 garment maker shops, 236 saloons, of which 108 were also brothels, and 18 disorderly places. I have no idea what a disorderly place was, but I wish I knew. It sounds very exciting, doesn't it? The real shocker in this list of numbers, I didn't even put up on the screen because I wanted to just make it a big reveal for you guys. In this entire neighborhood, in the entirety of the Lower East Side, there were only 34 bathtubs. Can you imagine? 34 bathtubs. 4 of them were in private houses, 12 of them were in barber shops, and 18 were in lodging houses. This is quite a picture, right? You cannot imagine these kind of listings on realtor.com. Most new immigrant arrivals lived in tenement apartment buildings. The expression tenement house, it just means really an apartment. It's a building that's subdivided to provide cheap rental accommodations. In the beginning of, before 1850, you would take a large house and subdivide it, generally speaking. After the 1850s, there were purpose-built tenements, purpose-built apartment houses of up to 6 stories, meant to house several households on each story, on each floor. And here's what scholar Deborah Dwork says about the tenements on the Lower East Side. Quote, "The living conditions on the Lower East Side must not be romanticized. There is a notion today that poor now is not like poor then. Old-time poverty is seen as clean and honest and upright. This is utter nonsense. Poverty on the Lower East Side was foul-smelling, it was noisy, it was diseased, and it was hungry. The number of tenement units without light, without ventilation, without hot running water, without baths or toilets was astonishing." Dwork found this another great study, which is the work of the 1900 Tenement House Committee, which produced a model of the Lower East Side block bounded by Christie, Forsyth Canal, and Bayard Streets. This is a typical Lower East Side block. Probably many of you have walked it yourself at one time or another. In 1900, the Tenement House Committee created a model of this block. You can see the model up there on the screen. And this model shows us that in this 80,000 square feet area, there were 39 tenement apartment buildings. Nearly all of them were 6 stories high. They housed 605 apartments within them. And within those apartments lived 2,781 people. So almost 3,000 people on this one city block. And for these 2,781 people, there were 246 toilets. That's it. Only 40 units out of all of the 605 apartments had hot water, and there was one single bathtub on this whole block, and that bathtub was wedged into an air shaft, so it was unusable. Of the 1,588 rooms on this block, 441 of them, 27% of them were completely dark. That means they had no access to outside air or light. And 635 rooms were ventilated only by dark, narrow air shafts. The disease toll, unsurprisingly, was high on the Lower East Side. Of course it was. There was no proper ventilation. There was no natural light. There was no hot running water. Diphtheria and tuberculosis ran rampant in these conditions on this block. Now, I share all of these numbers with you because I think that they help us to understand how close and unpleasant the living situation was on the Lower East Side. I think we look back on it with a kind of nostalgia, with rose-colored glasses, but we should also remember that life there was very hard. So the Lower East Side was dense, it was throbbing with street activity, it was teeming with life, it was crowded with very smelly people, but it was also temporary. It was a temporary home for most immigrant Jews. And this is what distinguished it from life in Russia, from Jewish life in Russia. There was no escaping the pale of settlement in Russia. Jews were legally required to be living within its boundaries. They were stuck there. But here in America, there was a path to leaving the Lower East Side. There was a path to leaving these tenements. Newcomers arrived, they found a place to rent, and when they could afford it, they moved to a better apartment and then to a better neighborhood. In New York at the turn of the century, this meant to Williamsburg or Brownsville in Brooklyn or up to Harlem. Here again, settlement is tied to technology. Movement to far-flung neighborhoods was made possible by the emergence of early forms of urban transportation in the first decades of the 20th century, especially streetcars, which allowed Americans to live in neighborhoods removed from their workplaces. For most Eastern European Jews living in New York City, that workplace, the place that they worked, was the garment industry. And it's the development of a different technology, the sewing machine, that allows for the expansion of garment work at the same time that Eastern European Jewish immigrants are arriving in this country. Here it's instructive to know something about the history of the garment industry so that you can see how technological development shapes economic opportunity. Until the 1850s, all sewing was done by hand. Until the 1850s, all sewing was done by hand. Two events revolutionized the garment industry in the mid-19th century: the invention of the sewing machine and the American Civil War. The sewing machine dramatically increased the speed at which garments could be sewn. For example, a 1910 Singer sewing machine advertisement suggested that a woman sewing machine operator could produce 3,300 stitches per minute on a Singer sewing machine. Can you imagine? That is an astonishing amount of stitches. No one is making 3,000 stitches by hand. That's just not a thing that you could even have realistically ever taken place. So machine is making sewing much, much faster. The Civil War, which followed shortly after the 1850s invention of a sewing machine, created the need for uniforms that transformed small shops, which had been making hand-produced garments, into workshops and kind of proto-factories, churning out clothes for soldiers. In this way, the invention of a new machine plus increased demand for garments birthed the modern American garment industry. New York emerged as the center of that garment industry, although Chicago and Boston and Baltimore and Rochester and Cleveland were also quick to adopt new technology and start to produce ready-made clothing. By 1910, New York was producing 70% of the nation's ready-made clothing for women. 70%. 40% of the nation's ready-made clothing for men was being produced in New York City. Much of that garment manufacturing was done by immigrant Jews, either in apartment workshops or in the more modern factories that came into being by the 1920s. By 1900, 60% of employed Jews in New York City worked in the garment industry. 60% of employed Jews in New York City made a living in the garment industry. One of the notable characteristics of this industry was that it took little capital to move from employee to employer. Most of the contractors in the garment industry's shops came from the ranks of relatively recent Jewish immigrants who had worked for a contractor themselves before becoming one. The contractor is the person who received garments from a manufacturer. The garments had been cut, but not yet sewn. So in the contractor's apartment or in a loft that he would rent, the contractor would bring together a group of workers, both women and men, including sewing machine operators, finishers, basters, pocket makers, and pressers. The contractor worked in the same space as the workers to complete the garments. Jews dominated this industry from top to bottom, from the manufacturers to the contractors to the laborers to the union activists who were bent on organizing the workers. They all spoke the same language, they had the same history, and they had a common understanding of communal and familial patterns.
You're tired or in pain, or both?
I hope no one is tired or in pain. Except the Jews on the Lower East Side. They were probably often tired and in pain. So the fact that a fellow Jew could be the contractor and also was a recent immigrant and hadn't needed really a vast amount of money to get his start offered workers the sense that they too could aspire one day to self-employment. So what we're seeing here is that even though the Lower East Side was crowded and dirty and work was difficult and low paying, there was opportunity for mobility up the economic ladder and out to a better neighborhood. This is the promise of America, the land, the golden land of opportunity. Here you had the opportunity to jump on the capitalist bandwagon, but you also had the opportunity to oppose the capitalist bandwagon or to try and reform it. Remember that a lot of these Eastern European Jewish immigrants had embraced socialism as a way to remake the world in Russia. We learned about this last week. When faced with poor working conditions in American sweatshops and factories, they pulled out their old playbooks for workplace reform. In this way, Eastern European Jewish immigrants fueled the labor movement in the garment industry. Many Jewish immigrants came to America with inflated, sometimes extraordinary expectations, only to discover that capitalist America was no utopia. Disillusionment fed radical discontent here. One garment worker put it this way, quote, "Many girls came here from a revolutionary background. They were struck by the atmosphere of freedom here, but then they were plunged into the sweatshop. The sweatshop was not only a physical condition, but amoral and aspiritual. They found there was no Bill of Rights in the sweatshop." Motivated by their radical Russian roots and their commitment to realizing justice in America, Jewish workers formed, joined, and led trade unions, especially and most significantly, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. What did these unions do? They mainly organized strikes demanding decent working conditions and fair labor practices. They also served as social welfare agencies for their members. Employees in the garment factories on the Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century were laboring 65 hours a week. At the height of the season, sometimes they would work 75 hours a week and sometimes even all night long. Not infrequently, they were obliged to provide their own needles, their own thread, their own knives, their own irons, and occasionally even their own sewing machines. And this was not easy. If you could picture in your head how large a sewing machine was in the early part of the 20th century, like it's literally often embedded in an actual desk, right? You know, with drawers. So it's not like a thing you can schlep back and forth every day, and it's quite a large investment. These workers in the garment factory were, if they didn't have their own equipment, were charged to use the equipment that the employer had there for them. They were also charged for their clothing lockers, and they were charged for the chairs that they sat in during the day to work. If these workers were late, they were fined for tardiness. If they damaged a garment, they were fined for the damage to the garment. Many companies actually, as a precaution against what they called interruption of work, locked the employees into the factory during the day. Only the foreman had the key. He was the only one who could unlock and let anyone out. This was a very serious fire hazard, as was discovered later with the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. If you have small children or grandchildren in your life, there's a wonderful picture book called Brave Girl. It's up there on the screen, which is about Clara Lemlich and the shirtwaist makers strike of 1909. Clara Lemlich was a Jewish immigrant who came to New York from Ukraine at the age of 16, and then a few years later, at the age of 23, led the largest strike of women workers in American history. And I want to share Clara Lemlich's story with you tonight because it illustrates so many of the things that we've talked about with Russian Jewish immigration. And so as I'm sharing her story with you, I want you to listen for elements of the immigrant experience that we have discussed together so far. So Clara Lemlich, you can see her up there on the screen. She's in the middle. She's a very tiny, petite person. Clara Lemlich was born in 1886 in Ukraine to deeply religious parents. Like most girls, Jewish girls, she was taught Yiddish, but offered no further Jewish schooling. Her parents were willing to send her to public school, but Russia's public schools excluded Jews after the passage of the May laws. Angered by the Russian government's anti-Semitism, her parents forbid her from speaking Russian or to bring Russian books into their home. But Clara was a headstrong and intellectually curious child, and she therefore commenced a secret study of Russian language and Russian literature. Before she was even in her teens, Clara was sewing buttonholes on shirts to pay for books. Already fluent in written Yiddish, she would fatten her book fund by writing letters for illiterate mothers to send to their children in America. When her father discovered a secret cache of Russian literature hidden under a meat pan in the kitchen, he burned the whole lot, and Clara had to start collecting books again. She began after that to store books in her attic, where she would perch on a beam there to read. One really nice Sabbath afternoon, she took her books outside while her family was sleeping, and she was discovered reading there by a neighbor. He not only kept her secret, this neighbor, but started to loan her revolutionary tracts from his own collection. By the time of the Kishinev pogrom in 1903, which convinced her parents to immigrate to the United States, 17-year-old Clara was a committed revolutionary. So already in Clara's girlhood, we see some familiar elements, right? The melas and the pogroms shape her family's life and their decision to emigrate to the United States. Her socialist neighbor introduces her to new ideas about how to change the world. Once she arrives in America, like many young immigrant Jewish girls, Clara Lemlich finds work on the Lower East Side in a garment shop. She's infuriated by the working conditions that she experiences there. She says, in the garment industry, human beings, quote, are reduced to the status of machines. And outraged by the treatment of men and women in the garment industry, she begins to organize the fledgling International Ladies Garment Workers Union in about 1905. A couple years later, in November 1909, she decides to try to take the women workers who she's organized on strike with her. And this is absolutely against the advice of male union leaders and also more conservative middle class women union leaders who felt like young girls working in the garment industry could not be radicalized, could not show up in force in any serious way to protest their working conditions. But it turned out that they were absolutely wrong. And in this very famous speech that Clara Lemlich gives in 1909 at New York's Cooper Union, she calls in Yiddish for all of her fellow ladies garment workers to unite and strike against their horrible working conditions. And to the surprise of almost everyone except for Clara Lemlich, between 20 and 30,000 young women garment workers walk off their jobs over the next couple of days. And these are predominantly Jewish women immigrants. This outpouring, this strike, is known as the Uprising of 20,000. It stunned employers at the time. In consternation, they weaponized all of the weapons they had at their disposal. They sent out the police, they sent out thugs to beat up these girls. 700 girls were arrested, 19 were sent to the workhouse. Lemlich herself had 6 ribs broken as a result of being roughed up by the police. When upper class New Yorkers saw this, they saw in the newspaper accounts of these young girls, these impoverished young immigrant girls being beaten up by the police and hired thugs. They were shocked. So that about a year later, in 1910, management started to understand that they had lost the war of public opinion. Evidently, the strikers were willing to continue through the entire next fashion season, so it was time to negotiate. After 2 weeks of intense discussions, an agreement was reached, and it was called the Protocol of Peace. Under its terms, the manufacturers consented to reduce the work week to 52 hours, to provide, and also to provide 4 legal holidays during the year to their employees with pay. Employees were no longer required to supply their own tools, and a joint grievance committee would negotiate issues going forward as they arose. So it was a successful strike in that it established a precedent for serious collective action in other branches of the garment economy and eventually in the American economy at large. It also galvanized the fledgling International Ladies Garment Workers Union and set off a wave of women's strikes between 1909 and 1915 that spread from New York to Philadelphia, to Cleveland, to Chicago, yay for Ohio, for all of our Ohio people here, to Iowa, to Kalamazoo in Michigan. But it didn't, the strike was good. It did a lot of good work. It did not create a perfect environment for workers. Negotiators were unable to advance young women's demands for safer working conditions. They didn't get rid of that locking of people in, or they didn't get any requirements for fire escapes. And that lapse would come back to haunt the union in March of 1911, just a year later, when the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City killed 146 workers, mostly Jewish and Italian women. But back to Clara for a minute. After the strike, the uprising of 20,000 in 1909, Clara was actually blacklisted from New York garment shops. And so she turned her energies to the suffrage movement. She helps to found the Wage Earners League for Women's Suffrage, a working class suffrage group. She was a fiery and effective agitator for the vote. However, she was eventually fired from her paid position as an organizer because she refused to moderate her tone. She refused to moderate her radical politics to suit middle-class suffragists. In 1913, Clara gets married to a printer called Joe Shavelson, and they move to Brownsville. They are able to move up in the world, out to a different neighborhood. They're in Brownsville in Brooklyn. They have 3 children there. Far from the shop floor, Clara begins to organize wives and mothers around such issues as housing and food and public education. She was a leader in the kosher meat boycotts of 1917, called to protest rapid price increases, and in the rent strike movement that swept New York City in 1919, when a post-war housing shortage dramatically increased the cost of decent housing. She continued to organize throughout her life. She really is a remarkable activist right up until the end. At age 81, Clara moved into the Jewish Home for the Aged in Los Angeles, and during her years there, she persuaded the administrators to honor the grape and lettuce boycott then being promoted by the United Farm Workers, and she helped the orderlies in her old age home to organize a union. She's really just remarkable. Okay, so far we have seen tonight an Eastern European Jewish community that's mostly living in New York City with their landsmen. They're working in the garment industry, and in some cases, they're working for better, more fair labor conditions. But what about when they weren't working? What kind of culture did they create on the Lower East Side? Well, it wasn't a culture of bathing, we know that much. But seriously, in addition to radical politics, Eastern European Jewish immigrants brought with them the great tradition of Yiddish culture in the form of plays and films and newspapers. And this culture is important in that it serves as a transition from old world to new. It contains comforting elements of the old world because it's Yiddish in its form, but it also helps to ease the transition to America. As much of the content of the plays and the newspapers addresses American values and American ideals. So I want to close tonight by talking for a few minutes about the Yiddish theater and the Yiddish press as important agents of acculturation. The Yiddish theater actually had its origins in the Old World. Modern Yiddish performances and skits were developed in the 1870s as part of a Russian Jewish cultural revival in the Pale of Settlement. By the early 1880s, many impoverished Yiddish theater companies were performing throughout the larger towns and cities of Eastern Europe. But actors in the Yiddish theater suffered harassment both from the Tsarist government and also from Orthodox rabbis who disapproved of this mode of Jewish expression. Numerous Jewish theater people immigrated to the United States after 1883, when the Yiddish theater was banned by Tsar Alexander III. So Yiddish theater arrives in New York City as a kind of refugee from Russia, and it's nurtured here at the turn of the century by its greatest audience, the largest, and quite possibly the loudest collection of Jews in the world. By 1900, there were 3 significant three major Yiddish theater troupes in the United States. I'm sorry, three major theater troupes in New York City, and numerous smaller theater troupes in other Jewish population centers in America. These troupes adapted the works of Shakespeare and Ibsen and Chekhov into Yiddish. So first they translated these plays into Yiddish, and then they adapted them to the needs of immigrant culture. What does this look like? It looks like selecting plays that have an emphasis on of themes that resonate with their audiences, and then delivering those plays in a way that could generously be described as flamboyant. One critic observed that more than anything else, Yiddish theater, with its overstatement and ritual pageantry, resembled the Italian opera without the singing. By 1918, New York City boasted 20 Yiddish theaters, which in a single year before the advent of the movies, attracted 2 million patrons to over 1,000 performances. Critic Hutchins Hapgood wrote that Jews of every station and persuasion came to the theater. Quote, the Jews of all of the ghetto classes, the sweatshop woman with her baby, the day laborer, the small Hester Street shopkeeper, the Russian Jewish anarchist and socialist, the rabbi and the scholar, the poet and the journalist. The poor and ignorant are in the great majority, but the learned, the intellectual, and the progressive are also present, he wrote. And the involvement of the audience, the involvement of all of these people in the theater-going experience was total, and it was fervent. Crying was always part of an evening at the Yiddish theater, which was kind of cathartic for the bone-weary workers who made up most of the house. Laughter at the characters who had familiar problems was just as prevalent as tears. And it really helped the immigrants to recognize their own strength, their own motivation, to recognize and remember those things. This wasn't a fancy kind of theater-going experience. It was kind of more like group therapy with snacks. Patrons ate and drank. They exchanged loud remarks. They unabashedly cheered and hissed at the stage. Sometimes they would openly jeer at actors who lit cigarettes and cigars on stage on Friday night, even while they themselves, the protesters themselves, were obviously not observing the Sabbath either because they were at the theater. Occasionally, patrons yelled out advice to the actors on the stage, particularly at critical points in the many, many plays that were about family conflict. Family life and its problems, family conflict, preoccupied Jewish playwrights in the Yiddish theater. For example, Leon Kobrin's comedy, The Next Door Neighbors, dealt with difficulties faced by a couple who did not immigrate together, and Gordon's Mirala Ephros, which was also known as the Yiddish Queen Lear, was a melodrama about a self-sacrificing mother, which instructed members of the audience to respect their parents. These plays, as well as many other plays by Yiddish writers at the time, Yiddish theater writers at the time, focused on these themes that would really resonate with their audiences. One of the first jobs I had when I was in graduate school was actually cataloging the Yiddish theater poster collection at the American Jewish Historical Society. And I put two of my favorites up there on the screen, The Rabbi's Family and East Side Sadie. But there are just dozens of great titles that would be performed over and over again on the Lower East Side as new waves of immigrants came in and wanted to see themselves, their own struggles reflected on the stage. The popularity of these shows was largely a result of the fact that these characters on stage were facing problems that were similar to the problems of every immigrant. How can you be both American and Jewish? How do you protect your family from destabilization? How do you protect religious values from disintegrating in a secular society? How do you enjoy America? How do you enjoy these opportunities for material success without giving up the spiritual values of Judaism? These were questions that preoccupied people who were still very much a part of two different worlds, right? The old world and the new world. And the Yiddish theater helped these immigrants deal with those questions, in this case by portraying them on stage. The Yiddish theater combined aspects of old world culture American culture and the transitional culture of the Lower East Side. And in this way, the Yiddish theater held a mirror up to its audiences. It helped them to gain a better understanding of their role in the historical process of relocation, and it gave them greater insight into the problems of creating new identities in the new world. The Yiddish press played a similar role. In New York City, which was the hub of the Yiddish American universe, over 150 Yiddish dailies, weeklies, monthlies, quarterlies, festival journals, and yearbooks appeared between 1885 and 1914. Some 20 dailies came into existence during that period, and for a time, at the turn of the century, as many as 6 competed simultaneously for readers. The Tagblatt, founded in 1885, represented the Orthodox religious point of view. The Morgen Journal was also Orthodox and was the first successful Yiddish morning paper. The 1890s saw the beginning of the Vorwärts, the Jewish Daily Forward, which is still in publication, which then was a socialist paper under the guiding hand of its famous editor, Abraham Kahan. It became the largest Yiddish newspaper in the world. In that same decade, the Freie Arbeiterstimme was born, representing the anarchists. Whether you were politically conservative or radical, whether the paper was politically conservative or radical, whether it was theologically orthodox or secular, the Yiddish press was often sensationalist and extremist, just like the Yiddish theater. It would lash out at capitalists, socialists, Jewish institutions, and competing papers. Despite this tendency, something remarkable was happening in the Yiddish press in the United States. As Abe Kahan, the editor, longtime editor of the Forward, pointed out, quote, the 5 million Jews living under the Tsar had not a single Yiddish daily paper, even when the government allowed such publication. While Russian Jews in New York, in America, published 6 dailies, countless Yiddish weeklies and monthlies, and enough books to make New York the largest Yiddish book market in the world. Although it promoted a modern Yiddish literature, the press was also an effective agent of acculturation, nourishing the process of Americanization for the Jewish masses in their own language. Poems and stories dealing with the realities of America and the difficulties of adjustment helped the immigrants to understand their new environment and to be less green. I don't mean environmental, I mean like greenhorns. Yiddish newspapers focused on specifically Jewish problems, but editorially, they frequently commented on purely American issues. They consistently emphasized the acquisition or development of desirable qualities and manners. They taught American history and geography, and they made untiring efforts in correcting civic deficiencies, or what they saw as civic deficiencies in their readers. The masses, in turn, Jewish immigrants devoured this information and advice, especially from the Forward, but also from other papers. One of the Forward's best read innovations was the Bintel Brief. Many of you might be familiar with this column. The Bintel Brief, in Yiddish, it means, in English, it means a bundle of letters. This was a column that started in 1906 in the Forward, and it was a column that published letters from readers, often corrected or shortened by editors, and sometimes on slower days entirely invented by the editors, but there were genuine letters from recent immigrants in there as well. And these letters would be printed daily. And this was a marvelous outlet for immigrants who were troubled by tensions in their new life, and an affirmation for them that their problems mattered. They could be published in the newspaper. And immigrants wrote in about poverty, they wrote in about sickness, about love and divorce and unemployment and intermarriage and conflicts of opinion about socialism and generational conflicts and declining religious observance, just everything, all the stuff of life they would write to the Bintel Brief about. And then Abe Kahan, the editor of the Forward, would pen the responses himself. Later on, when the column got bigger, there was a staff, and they would sometimes write as well. And there are books that collect letters from the Bintel Brief. I'm going to put one up at the end if you're interested in reading some of these letters. They're really a kind of marvelous window into what was happening with Jews on the Lower East Side during this period. So at the same time that the Yiddish press was acting as an Americanization agent, it was also, like the Yiddish theater and the Landsmannschaften, and so many of the turn of the century Jewish immigrant institutions, playing an important part in the transitional, religiously based ethnic culture of the Lower East Side. So what I have tried to give you tonight is a portrait of the Lower East Side at the turn of the century, a sense of the lives, the homes, the working conditions, the culture of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who lived there on the Lower East Side. But I would be remiss if I left you tonight without at least starting to answer the biggest and the most essential historical question, namely, why does this matter? Why does this matter? What does this community tell us about American Jewish life and the American Jewish experience? And I want to suggest a couple of answers to this question and then open it up for you to you for additional thoughts and additional questions. So what does this period, the Lower East Side American Jewish experience, tell us about American Jewish life? I think that it shows us the beginnings, the roots of some important American Jewish trends. The association of American Jews with liberal politics, for example, rose in large part from the socialist background of many of these immigrants, which found expression here in the movement for workers' rights. And those workers, the majority of them, labored in the garment industry, the shmata business, an industry that would continue to sustain many Jewish families for decades to come as children and grandchildren of these workers became clothing designers and manufacturers. We can also see on the Lower East Side, I think if we look at the Yiddish theater, the seeds of American Jewish involvement in the American entertainment industry. Many of the theater owners from the Yiddish theater, many of the actors from the Yiddish theater would go on to play a role in the development of the American entertainment industry, especially with movies. Finally, I think that we inherit from this wave of Jewish immigration the idea of American Jews as an urban people. The city was central to their identification. And when I say city here, I do not mean exclusively New York City. For many of these Eastern European Jews, the timing of their arrival meant that they met America during a period of industrialization when the most economic opportunities were in the biggest cities. In this way, Eastern European Jewish immigrants came to associate opportunity and prosperity with urban living. Not tenement living, right? We all love our bathtubs, but with the American city, which may not have had streets paved with gold, but offered nonetheless golden opportunities in politics, economics, education, and culture. As always, I have a few suggested sources for those of you who want more, who want to learn more. And as I mentioned last week, I will develop a bibliography that we can send out after the class is done that includes all of these sources. But if you can't wait and you need something to read this week, if you're like me and you're getting on a plane tomorrow and you need a book, this is what I recommend for the topics that we have covered today. And in case you're racing to write them down, I'll just say a sentence about each one before I close the slides and open up the room for questions. So what we've got up there tonight is a whole history of the Yiddish theater in New York, New York's Yiddish theater from the Bowery to Broadway. It's a scholarly history, so you have to really be interested in digging deep down. The other one on the top is also a scholarly history, the rag race, how Jews sewed their way to success. But this is it's a very well written, interesting history of Jewish involvement in the garment industry, both in Great Britain and in America. The Promised Land, which I mentioned last week, excellent autobiography of Mary Antin. Hester Street is a movie, you can stream it, about life on the Lower East Side, featuring the great Carol Kane. Brave Girl is the picture book that I mentioned. Such a wonderful present. If you need to buy a present for a child, let's say ages 8 and under, it's a great one. Lower East Side Memories, A Jewish Place in America is Hasia Diner's book. which is very much about how we remember the Lower East Side. So that's kind of cool. And then finally, we have the Bintel Brief, which is a collection of those letters that I mentioned to the Jewish Daily Forward. So that should give you plenty of places to go if you want to learn more about the topics I presented tonight.